Today in the EU, everything we know about the Draghi report.
And so what I'm proposing in the report that the President of the Commission asked me to prepare is radical change. But that is what is needed.
The forthcoming report of former Italian Prime Minister and former European Central Bank President Mario Draghi on the future of European competitiveness is a valuable opportunity to shape the EU policy agenda for the coming EU legislative term and beyond. The report will focus on the EU's aim to leverage its numerous strengths and competitive advantages, while also tackling existing challenges and facilitating the twin transition towards a sustainable and digital economy. But why has Draghi's report been delayed? And what reactions can we expect to it? Hello and welcome, I am Evi Chiori and this is Today in the EU. To understand better the content of the report and the reasons behind the delays, we're joined by our economy reporter, Thomas Moller-Nielsen. Hi, Tom.
Hello.
So, not too long ago, we discussed the letter report, which kept you very busy for the past few months. Now we're turning our attention to a highly anticipated new release, the Draghi report. What's up with everyone wanting to write a report these days?
We've spoken about this on the podcast before, but I guess we should probably take a little bit of a step back and understand the kind of broader context. So obviously, Europe's economy is not doing particularly well. It's set to grow much slower than China and the US, both this year and next year. The kind of immediate trigger for this was Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which led to energy prices soaring, which then fed into sort of general inflation, which peaked at 10.6% in October 2022. This led the European Central Bank to hike interest rates, which have depressed demand and made investments much more difficult. So that was the kind of immediate trigger for Europe's economic woes, but there are broader structural problems.
Like?
This is the stuff that Draghi is gonna address.
Okay.
But this is why European leaders right now are very obsessed with it. How can we get Europe growing again? How can we boost Europe's economy? What is it that we have to do?
So according to this, what do we have to do?
In June last year, the European Council said, okay, what we need is a high-level report published by someone, respectable, who will tell us how to integrate the single market.
All this sounds nice, but what can we understand from it?
The way to think about this is, if Europe's economy is going to get back on track, it's going to need an integrated single market. That's a necessary but not a sufficient condition to have a growing economy. America's single market is already basically integrated. Yeah. China's single market is also integrated. Ours isn't, at least in certain specific sectors. So in June, the European Council called for this high-level report. In September, it was decided that Enrico Letta would write this report, and that report came out in April.
And can you remind us what was the focus of the report?
Letta focused on three specific areas where Europe's single market isn't sufficiently integrated. So it was financial services, telecommunications, and energy. And he said basically he had a series of proposals for how you integrate these. The thing about that report that I think is worth noting, it's much less controversial. I think basically all European leaders agree that Europe's single market needs to be integrated. Yeah. They agree that those specific sectors need to be integrated. If you look at the acknowledgements of this report, of Letta's report, which is around 147 pages long, he thanks basically a series of European leaders. He says, thank you, Charles Michel, the President of the European Council. Thank you, Ursula von der Leyen, the President of the European Commission.
So what does all this thanking list mean?
I think the way to interpret it is basically European leaders wanted someone officially outside of the system, so to speak, to lay out the policy proposals that they wanted. European leaders basically universally said, this is great. Everyone really liked it, apparently. Belgium were very much in favor of it. They liked the proposals. Hungary, the bad boy of Europe, likes it. Apparently, Viktor Orban, from what I heard, was very much really enjoyed Letta's the presentation that he made at the European Council in April. So I think that's kind of the way to think about that report. It was just a way of sort of getting a guy outside the system to basically put on paper what European leaders basically want anyway. And again, there are certain controversial issues, but it's a much less controversial topic than the Draghi report, which we'll come to, because everyone basically agrees that the single market needs to be completed, basically.
Yeah. And there was speculation that the report would be released this week to inform discussions for the strategic agenda that the European leaders will need to adopt at the Council meeting on Thursday and Friday. However, it is indeed taking longer than expected. What's causing the hold-up?
No one has seen the report really, apart from Draghi and his researchers. But Draghi has spoken 3 times over the last year, basically laying out in rough terms what the report is going to contain. So in February, and this is the controversial part, he said,
these changes have a variety of consequences. One of which is clear is that we'll have to invest an enormous amount in a relatively short time in Europe.
If it's going to facilitate the green and digital transition. So if it's going to properly digitalize its economy and if it's going to effectively combat climate change. And he said, and this money, he said, was in the region of 500 billion. Right, 1/3 of which has to come from the public sector. Now, this is very controversial. So a lot of fiscal hawks, people who don't like spending public money, were vehemently against this. I mean, they were very critical. They said, what is this? Right-wing politicians, openly said on the floor of the European Parliament, this is a lot of money. European taxpayers aren't going to be able to afford this. But another issue is, so in April, Draghi gave a speech in La Hulpe in Belgium, and he said that Europe needs to focus on scale. We need bigger companies, basically, especially in the defense sectors and the telecommunication sectors. He says, look, in America, they've got basically 3 major telecoms companies. In Europe, we have more than 30. This isn't good. We need bigger companies because these companies need to make investments. And that's also very controversial.
In what sense?
If you're going to push for these European champions, it's very easy for right-wing populists to say, Europe is going to take your money and give it to mega companies, right? So I think this is why the report was delayed until after the elections, precisely because it would kind of amplify certain right-wing populist messages. And as we know, the right-wing populists did pretty well at the elections.
That's true.
There's another question, which is, well, why hasn't the report come out now? I mean, the elections have happened. What's going on? I mean, there are elections in France that are ongoing. You might say that's a possible reason, but honestly, we don't really know.
And you've been following this for a while now with a lot of briefings and speaking to lots of analysts and experts about what to expect. What did they say about the report?
I've spoken to some analysts who have spoken with Draghi's team, and Draghi's team were very cautious about revealing anything from the report. But they still seem to be soliciting opinions. I mean, they're going to different people and saying, hey, what do you think of this? What do you think of this? What do you think of this? So it does seem to me possible that the report might be delayed even further. But as to the specific reasons as to why, given the elections have happened, that's an open question.
And as you mentioned, Draghi has publicly discussed some aspects of the report, such as scale, that you explained already. But what other areas are we falling short in, and what will be addressed in the report?
The other thing he said was that Europe needs to improve its provision of public goods, basically. So increase public spending, for instance, in energy infrastructure, energy grids, also in the defense sector, supercomputing capacity, things like that. So, Europe needs to find more public money to make these sorts of investments. And then the third thing he spoke about in the April speech in Belgium was the need to improve, or rather diversify, Europe's supply of critical materials. I think we've spoken about this on the podcast before, but Europe has this Critical Materials Act, and the goal basically is to diversify its supply of critical materials away from China. The logic behind this derives from the aftermath of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The reason being that, we were much too dependent on Russia for energy. And so European leaders now are thinking, well, we're very dependent on China for critical materials. If something goes wrong with China, if they invade Taiwan or whatever, we could be in a similar situation. We're heavily dependent upon them for materials that we need for batteries and so on and so forth. So this could be a problem. And Draghi was saying, look, but we need to accelerate this. We need to have complementary measures, and we need to make sure that, that we ensure our security of supply. He basically says the Critical Raw Materials Act as it stands is not sufficient. So those are the 3 things he said, basically. So scale, provision of public goods, and improve Europe's security of supply for critical inputs. I should also say that when he was speaking about ensuring the supply of critical inputs, he wasn't just talking about critical materials. He was also talking about getting highly skilled workers to come to Europe. Now, that's also quite a controversial thing. Obviously, as we know, at the European elections, a lot of voters voted for parties who are very anti-immigrant. That was the April speech. In the June speech, he emphasized a lot. There's another huge amount of emphasis on scale. And even more controversially, I would say, he spoke about subsidies and tariffs. It was in September last year that von der Leyen in her State of the Union speech announced that Draghi would be writing this report. He's a very well-respected guy. He was the president of the European Central Bank between 2011 and 2019. People often describe him as being the person who saved the euro. because in 2012, when financial markets were very jittery about Greece, there being a potential Grexit, although I'm not sure that word existed at the time, but they were worried that Greece, it did. They were very worried about Greece leaving the euro, and then Draghi came out and said, no, we're going to do whatever it takes.
Within our mandate, the ECB is ready to do whatever it takes to preserve the euro. And believe me, it will be enough.
And von der Leyen echoed that in her speech.
And set out how we remain competitive as we do that. And that is why I have asked Mario Draghi, one of Europe's great economic minds, to prepare a report on the future of European competitiveness, because Europe will do whatever it takes to keep its competitive edge.
The idea being, we think China is subsidizing its electric vehicle manufacturing at an unfair rate, and this is posing a threat to Europe and European automobile workers.
The Commission is launching an anti-subsidy investigation into electric vehicles coming from China.
Earlier this month, Europe announced provisional tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles. Now, it's very controversial. It was pushed heavily, or rather Spain and France were heavily in favor of these things. However, Germany in particular, which is heavily exposed to the Chinese market, is very much against it. Now, Draghi came out in his speech in June, which he gave only a couple of weeks ago, and he said basically, tariffs and subsidies, but tariffs in particular, sometimes they might have to be necessary.
Tariffs must, of course, be balanced by consumer interest. There may be some industries where domestic producers have fallen too far behind already. And so making imports more expensive because of tariffs will only impose deadweight costs on our economy.
He was very cautious. He said, it should be part of a general strategy and so on and so forth. But my point is, he has said some quite controversial things. And I think also, quite apart from the kind of specific policy proposals that he's suggesting, just the issue of competitiveness is itself quite a controversial issue. As one analyst put to me, they said, look, when it comes to competitiveness, a lot of it is about which industries are we going to support? Where can Europe be competitive going forward? Where can it not be competitive going forward? In the June speech, Draghi said, tariffs must, of course, be balanced by consumer interests. There may be some industries where domestic producers have fallen too far behind already, and so making imports more expensive because of tariffs will only impose deadweight costs on our economy. Mm-hmm. What Draghi is saying is, look, there might be some industries where which just can't be saved in Europe. One would imagine he might be talking about something like the solar panel manufacturers. Yeah. China dominates 80% of the global market. But my point is, when it comes to competitiveness and when it comes to these sorts of issues, in particular European industry, just the nature of the topic, so to speak, is itself controversial.
And as you very correctly mentioned, Draghi is a highly respected figure in the EU, and his name has been floated for nearly every top job. Is this report so important because Mario Draghi is the author, or is it the substance?
I think both. I would say, though, I should temper what I just said about Draghi being respected. He's not liked by a lot of left-wing groups in particular and progressives. So when it comes to Greece, for instance, Greece obviously suffered austerity whilst Draghi was the head of the ECB. I would say, though, that there are questions to be asked about the report, for sure, despite the fact that he's obviously a very respected figure, very intelligent guy. So the fact the report is focusing on competitiveness itself, or rather, I should say, there are kind of broader concerns that the report might be perhaps slightly too business friendly. The reason being that Draghi, he's a technocrat. He's also a former Goldman Sachs banker. And this idea of competitiveness itself, the term comes from business science. Yeah. It's not really used by economists. I mean, if you talk to a lot of economists, they say, no, you should just, the word competitiveness is too nebulous. You should focus on something like productivity or something like that. Yeah. So there is that concern. And I think, but Draghi, in fairness to him, he has tried to address these concerns. So in the June speech, one of the first things he says is Europe's social services, they have to be protected. And he said that is non-negotiable. That's the first thing he said. He also ended the speech and said in the same way, he said, it's non-negotiable. We have to preserve Europe's social safety net. So he is trying to address that. When he met with the European Trade Union Confederation, which is the organization that represents around 45 million European workers, again, he reiterated this and he said, yes, look, Europeans must be or we must focus on preserving Europe's social safety net. And he pointed to the Nordic model, so Denmark and Sweden and all these other countries, and said, look, that's an example that we have to follow. So there is this concern about Draghi, being a technocrat, being, a former investment banker. But at the same time, he has seemed to he has tried to address this in his speeches. And unions, I think, I would probably say, cautiously optimistic that it's not going to be too business friendly, that it is going to also contain proposals that are going to be pro-worker as well as pro-business.
Right, and you said that Hungary's Prime Minister Viktor Orban was quite excited about the Letta report. What do you think will be the reaction to Draghi's report, given the fact that Hungary will be holding EU's rotating presidency from July?
So when Enrico Letta presented his report at the European Council in April, Hungary seemed to be quite taken with what was proposed. I think it is going to be interesting to see whether Hungary is going to be similarly taken with Draghi's proposals. In their agenda, or in their program for their upcoming presidency, they have put competitiveness front and center. They say, yes, competitiveness, we have to focus on it. But we'll have to see whether, when it comes to Draghi's specific proposals, whether they'll be on board with it. I would suspect that when it comes to immigration,
there will be resistance.
I think there's going to be quite a lot of resistance, but that's something that we're going to have to see. But I think it will be very interesting to see what happens going forward.
Right, and when the report is out, of course, we will have a look together at the consequences and the reactions to it. Thank you, Tom, for joining me on this episode. I am Evi Chiori, and this was Euractiv's Today in the EU podcast. Visit Euractiv to stay on top of the latest news, sign up for our podcast newsletter, and if you haven't subscribed yet, you can find us on all streaming platforms. And please make sure to leave a comment or review on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Your reviews help us a lot to spread the word on our work. This episode was produced by Miriam Sáenz de Tejada, Nicoleta Yonta, and me. Thank you for tuning in. We will be back tomorrow morning. As part of our commitment to accuracy, inclusion and transparency, Euractiv is part of the Trust Project.